You may begin whenever you're ready.
Terrific. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hewlett-Woodmere Public Library's presentation of Langston Hughes and the Harlem Renaissance. My name is Dr. Bill Thierfelder, and I'll be your host today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a retired professor of arts and humanities and a docent emeritus from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. I currently live in Portland, Oregon, where I'm a lecturer, writer, and artist, and it's where I'm speaking to you from today. I do, however, get back to the East Coast from time to time and enjoy the wonders of the Big Apple and some of the great East Coast cities. Now, because we can't cover everything about this presentation in one, this topic in one presentation, I'd like to invite you to take a deeper dive number 15 at my website, which is makingwings.net, and I'll demonstrate. So that's one word, makingwings.net. And if you do that, you should be seeing now, but I'll make sure. I'll just quickly reshare. This is my home page. Find out a little more about me. But if you go to the hamburger menu in the upper left corner and click on that, you will see a drop down. Please feel free to visit any of these, including my upcoming lecture schedule. You'll see a bunch of deeper dives. And today it's number 15. So you're going to go to that first batch. You're going to click the downward arrow. And these are all programs that I have given or will be giving in the future. Today is number 15, Langston Hughes. So you click on that. And what you're going to find is a brief biography, some recommended media, and I'll be talking about some of these books during the presentation. If you don't have a paper and pencil handy, you can always go to my website. Printed resources, video resources, a Harlem Renaissance overview, and then some of the important areas in Harlem, such as the Schomburg Center, um, the bibliography of Langston Hughes. He wrote poetry, he wrote fiction, prose, lots of wonderful children's books. Um, and then I have a section about his selected poetry and about his home, about the Broadway musical he wrote called Street Scene. So all cool stuff. By the way, for any of these, so let's say you wanted to go to the Poetry Foundation's uh, site about Langston Hughes, you just click on that and you'll be brought to that page. You could look at it. When you're done, you just click it and then you're back on mine. So it's kind of one-stop shopping, and I hope you can take advantage. Lots of cool stuff there. So everything that you're going to hear in the program today uses the web resources and the books that you just saw on my website. Now, for this presentation, I especially used the following to build its structure and the script: the History Channel, Britannica, vetted articles in Wikipedia, the Poetry Foundation, and a chronology of the life of Langston Hughes that you can find in the collected poems of Langston Hughes, edited by Arnold Rampersad. We'll be talking more about him in just a moment. Now, one of the things that you saw on the website was recommended reading and viewing. Now, for more information about the Harlem Renaissance, I recommend these three terrific resources. The first is called Voices from the Harlem Renaissance, edited by Nathan Huggins. The Encyclopedia of the Harlem Renaissance, by Aberjani and Sandra West, and When Harlem Was in Vogue by David Lewis. And all three are wonderful resources. Now, as far as Langston Hughes, there are two really fine biographies that I recommend. One is Laurie Leach's biography. It's one volume and an excellent introduction to his life. But there's the two-volume biography by Arnold Rampersad. Volume one describes his life before the Second World War, and volume two follows his life until his death in 1967. So it really depends on how much you want to know, but both biographies, the Leach and the Rampersad, are excellent. Now, we're going to look at the Harlem Renaissance first to give you the context for Langston Hughes's life. The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural and intellectual movement that encompassed African American music, dance, art, literature, theater, politics, and even clothing fashion. It centered in Harlem, an area in Manhattan from approximately 110th Street north into the 150s, and all the way from the west side to the east side of Manhattan Island. This Renaissance, so-called, took flight around the end of the First World War in 1918, peaked during the 1920s and 30s, and came to an end. It was more of a fizzle out during the Second World War. The Renaissance was indeed the result of many factors, but one of the main ones was called the Great Migration, which was the movement of over 6 million African Americans out of the South, the southern United States, out of the South to urban centers in the Northeast, the Midwest, and West. Blacks were just fed up with and terrified by the rampant discrimination and violence of the South, and they moved to cities like Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, and of course, New York. Now, this migration started around 1916, peaked in the 1930s through about the 1950s, and ended about 1970. Now, this next slide poses the question, though, why Harlem? What about Harlem made it ripe for this New York Renaissance, this Harlem Renaissance, as opposed to, let's say, Queens or Brooklyn, for example? Well, one of the main factors was that Harlem was originally meant to be an uptown community for white owners. But overbuilding in the area left landlords looking for tenants. So middle-class blacks from the South and elsewhere began moving in. Landlords loved it. Hey, you're paying the rent, you're paying our expenses, so come on down. And many of the whites who had moved there and who had originally lived there, they began moving out. Yes, racism and prejudice was and is everywhere. Well, by the 1920s, Harlem was one of the largest black communities in America, from the rich businessmen of Sugar Hill to the poorer citizens of the eastern and western fringes. And to meet the demands of this growing population, restaurants, music venues like jazz clubs, and stores were opened. And rather quickly, these different venues began to attract many artists, musicians, writers, and intellectuals. Now, some of the artists who made Harlem their home included Aaron Douglas and Jacob Lawrence. But a large number of women also thrived in Harlem, including sculptor Augusta Savage and the painter Lois Jones. Now, you can find out more about the artists, musicians, intellectuals, and writers of the Harlem Renaissance on my website. I have links. Harlem, of course, also became famous for its music scene, especially the abundance of black jazz musicians who emerged. Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Jelly Roll Morton, and King Oliver, to name just a few. Of course, The great irony is that these musicians performed in venues to almost all white audiences. So, although jazz was played primarily by blacks, the clubs they were performing in were not always racially friendly. So, places like the white-owned Cotton Club on 125th Street were created with the idea of creating a stylish environment for its entirely white clientele. In other words, while Harlem was very different from Jim Crow South in its blatant hatred and violence, it was also similar in many ways, especially regarding where people of color could eat, listen to music, or attend a movie. So, while there were no overt laws that put you in the back of the bus, though segregation laws had been abolished in New York in 1861, there was a covert understanding that that's exactly where you probably belonged, in the back of the bus or in the back balcony in the movie house. By the way, midtown venues like Carnegie Hall, which was down on 57th Street, had mixed race audiences for jazz concerts as early as 1912. And Benny Goodman's famous 1938 Carnegie Hall concert was performed by an integrated band. So I guess it isn't just a matter of practice, practice, practice that got you into Carnegie Hall, but also a matter of location, location, location. Now, moving along on your screen, you see the names of four of the great intellectual leaders of the Harlem Renaissance, including Arturo Schomburg, W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and A. Philip Randolph. That background photo that you see on your screen shows the world-renowned Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which was founded in 1926 and is now part of the New York Public Library system. And more information about Arturo Schomburg and that research center is on my website. And indeed, for anyone who's watching today and who's doing any kind of research into African American history, Black literature, etc., the Schomburg Center is a remarkable resource. And for those of you who live in the New York area, well worth a visit. Oh, and then you have the writers of the Harlem Renaissance. Now, on your screen, you see only a partial list, but it's truly a who's who honor roll of some of America's great 20th century writers, including James Weldon Johnson, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Nella Larson, Conti Cullen. And we add to that list that I've just put up on the top of the screen, we add to that list Ralph Ellison, Zora Neale Hurston, and Dorothy West. Now, several of these writers that you see on the screen here, well, they were involved in four of the most notable publications of the period. The Crisis, which is still published, is the official publication of the NAACP and the nation's oldest African American publication. But there was also, during the period of the Harlem Renaissance, Opportunity, The Messenger, and Negro World. As the editors on the website Thought Company say, these publications printed the work of Black artists and writers, helping the Harlem Renaissance become the artistic movement that made it possible for African Americans to develop an authentic voice in American society. Now, another publication that is seen as seminal to the Renaissance is a publication called Fire. One word, two exclamation points. And there you see the front cover on your screen on the right. Well, Fire was published in New York City in November of 1926. It was created by Langston Hughes and the writer and graphic artist Richard Nugent. Zora Neale Hurston, Gwendolyn Bennett, John Davis, and Aaron Douglas were on its editorial board. And the editor-in-chief was a young novelist and critic named Wallace Thurman. Thurman asked for poetry, art, fiction, drama, and essays from his editorial board and from leading figures in the New Negro Movement. That's what it was called, the New Negro Movement, centered in Harlem. And those writers included figures like Countee Cullen and Arna Botom. Now, unfortunately, in a moment of pure irony, after it published its first issue, which you see on the right of your screen, the headquarters for Fire burned down and the magazine ended. Fire ended Fire. And to answer your question, no, arson was never suspected. In fact, they believe it was faulty wiring of the building. So although this magazine had only one issue, Fire is considered an event of historical importance because of its far-ranging influence within the Black art and literary communities. And you can go online and actually get digital copies of this magazine still. It's really very impressive. Okay, so it was within this remarkable environment that we've just spoken about for the first 14 slides of this presentation that our poet Langston Hughes thrived. So what we're going to do is going to take a brief look at his life, but most of this program will be devoted to his poetry. For much more biographical information, again, you can visit my website. But for now, here's a thumbnail of his life and some of his wonderful poetry. As the curtain parts, we can say this. Langston Hughes was born on February 1st, so it's his birthday month, 1902, in Joplin, Missouri. When he was a small boy, his father, James, abandoned the family and moved to Mexico. As a result, much of his childhood was spent moving around America, living with various relatives, including his maternal grandmother in Kansas. Hughes finally settled down with his mother and his stepfather, Homer Clark, in Cleveland, Ohio. He went to high school there, and in his senior year was named the class poet. And when he was 17 years old, Hughes wrote The Negro Speaks a River on his way to reconcile with his father down in Mexico. Now, that meeting ultimately proved unsuccessful, but the poem became a landmark, as we're going to see in a little bit. And then we have the 1920s, which proved to be a pivotal decade for the young writer. The Negro Speaks of Rivers was published in July of 1921 in The Crisis when he was only 19 years old, and the poem truly marked the beginning of his career. Now, thanks to some money sent from that biological father who was living down in Mexico, he was able to attend Columbia University for a couple of years, 1921 to 1922. But Hughes, it turned out, was always a restless soul, so he left college and became a merchant seaman. At various ports, Hughes held a number of menial, quote-unquote, menial jobs, both overseas and in the United States. However, his wanderlust ultimately won out, and he left the high seas to live in Paris for a while. Now, indeed, Paris, you always hear Paris as a haven for artists. And next month, a little sneak preview, we're going to be talking about Gertrude Stein. Paris just becomes this great focal point. But For Hughes, it was always a refuge until his death, as it was for many Black artists and writers, because of its very open attitudes towards people of color. Now, back in America, a stint at a hotel as a busboy in Washington, D.C., proved fortunate because it was there that he met the American poet Vachel Lindsay. And Lindsay encouraged the young writer, and in 1926, Hughes published his first volume of poems called The Weary Blues, as well as an essay titled The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. The following year, he brought out his second collection of poems called Fine Clothes to the Jews. The success of those three works allowed him to return to college, and he attended Lincoln University in Chester County, Pennsylvania, and he graduated from there in 1929. Lincoln University is a historically Black college and university in our country. Now, during this same period of time in the 1920s, he befriended the novelist Zora Neale Hurston, as well as Hurston's patron, Charlotte Mason. In fact, Mason also provided patronship money to Hughes, just as she had done with Zora Neale Hurston. The more Hughes wrote, the more he kind of needed her funding, and she gave it. But also the more that Hughes wrote, the more he mined his love of jazz, often using the rhythms of jazz in his poetry. Now, unfortunately, Hughes had a falling out with the often domineering Mrs. Mason and the sometimes manipulative Zora Neale Hurston. And he decided to forge his own way. He kind of parted with them and he went on his own way. But you know something? He thrived. And he ended the decade with his first novel, Not Without Laughter. And it was a huge critical success. It ended up winning several awards, and it decidedly put Hughes on the map. By the way, I recommended it. It still reads very well. Here we see the 19-year-old Hughes on your left, and as a Washington, D.C. busboy in 1925, and that's the year he met Vachel Lindsay, and the year before he published his first collection of poems. On your left is a beautiful portrait of the 23-year-old Hughes by a New York City friend, the German artist who was living there, Winold Reiss, R-E-I-S-S, Winold Reiss. Today, that portrait hangs in the Smithsonian Institution's National Portrait Gallery. And on the right of your screen, you see Hughes in his senior year, 1929, at Lincoln University. But this is a photo taken in 1928. He graduated in 29. So why don't we take a pause here to listen to some of the poetry that Hughes published during the 1920s. There are links to all of these poems that you'll be hearing today on several websites that you can find on my website. Now, for this early period, I'd like to share three with you. And let's start with his first major poem, The Negro Speaks of River. Well, it was written when he was 17 and first published, as I told you, in The Crisis in 1921 when he was 19. It's a poem that celebrates the connection to the Black diaspora throughout time and place. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. Oh, I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. The next poem, called Negro, was first published when he was 19 years old, and it speaks to his belief that all Black people are interconnected through their collective history. I am a Negro, black as the night is black, black like the depths of my Africa. I've been a slave. Caesar told me to keep his doorsteps clean. I've brushed the boots of Washington. I've been a worker. Under my hand, the pyramids arose. I made mortar for the Woolworth building. And I've been a singer. All the way from Africa to Georgia, I carried my sorrow songs. I made ragtime, and I've been a victim. The Belgians cut off my hands in the Congo, and they still lynch me in Mississippi. I am a Negro, black as the night is black, black like the depths of my Africa. Our third poem is called The Weary Blues, which was the title poem of his first published collection and initially published in the May 1925 edition of Opportunity. Traditional rhythms using the beat and syncopation of jazz. Now, you can see this in the opening lines of the poem. I'm gonna read it in a kind of exaggerated way. It kind of imitates the flow of jazz riffs. Droning a drowsy, syncopated tune, rocking back and forth to a mellow croon. Okay, now obviously you wouldn't read it that way, but that's where the emphasis on the syllables goes. So the poem is a blues song, a true expression of the pain of love, loss, and being Black in a non-accepting community. Droning a drowsy, syncopated tune, rocking back and forth to a mellow croon, I heard a Negro play down on Lenox Avenue the other night by the pale, dull pallor of an old gaslight. He did a lazy sway. He did a lazy sway to the tune of those weary blues. With his ebony hands on each ivory key, he made that poor piano moan with melody. Oh, blues. Swaying to and fro on his rickety stool, he played that sad, raggy tune like a musical fool. Sweet blues, coming from a Black man's soul. Oh, blues. In a deep song voice, with a melancholy tone, I heard that Negro sing, that old piano moan. Ain't got nobody in all this world, ain't got nobody but myself, has gonna quit my frowning and put my troubles on the shelf. Thump, thump, thump went his foot on the floor. He played a few chords, then he sang some more. I got the weary blues, and I can't be satisfied. Got the weary blues and can't be satisfied. I ain't happy no more, and I wish that I had died. And far into the night he crooned that tune. The stars went out, and so did the moon. The singer stopped playing and went to bed, while the weary blues echoed through his head. He slept like a rock, or a man that's dead. Now, I highly recommend a 2024 collection called Blues in Stereo, edited by Denise Smith, which focuses on Hughes' early verse, especially this from the 1920s, like the ones I've just read to you. It's an excellent collection. Well, let's go back to the biographical overview. By the 1930s, Hughes was deeply intrigued by socialism, Marxism, and communism. But he also gave a reading tour of the South and the West where he met the Scottsboro Boys and became immediately taken up by their cause, which included writing about their case. Now, to refresh our memories, the Scottsboro Boys were 9 black teenagers aged 12 to 19 who were accused in Alabama of raping 2 white women in the year 1931. There were lynch mobs before the suspects were even indicted, not to mention all-white juries, rushed trials, and persistently disruptive mobs. According to the ACLU website, the Supreme Court eventually overturned all of the Scottsboro convictions. The majority opinion determined that the defendants were denied a fair trial due to ineffective counsel who had no time to prepare, resulting in a violation of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Meanwhile, in 1932, Hughes became part of a group of black people who went to the Soviet Union to make a film depicting the plight of African Americans in the United States. The film was never made, but Hughes was given the opportunity to travel through the Soviet Union and to the Soviet-controlled regions in Central Asia that were usually closed to Westerners. And then before returning to the States, he also traveled to China, Japan, and Haiti. And when he did return, he worked with migrant workers in California. And here you see a few more photos of Langston's Russian adventure. Now, as you can imagine, this fascination with communism would eventually come to haunt Mr. Hughes in the 1940s and 50s when the FBI and Joe McCarthy set their sights on him. Now, 1934 saw the publication of his wonderful short story in a collection called The Ways of White Folks. Wonderful, wonderful stories. I highly recommend it. In the same year of 1934, his biological father died. And what Hughes found out was that he wasn't even mentioned in his father's will. Needless to say, that was deeply hurtful. But Hughes soldiered on and went to Paris, and it was from there that he supported the Spanish Civil War, as many other Americans did, most notably Ernest Hemingway. In 1938, his mother died of breast cancer, another psychological loss that Hughes had to navigate. Hughes rounded out the decade by a foray into the movie industry, and in 1939 wrote the screenplay for the Hollywood musical Way Down South. The film ended up getting fine reviews and an Oscar nomination. Victor Young was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Music. Now, as it turned out, this would not be Hughes's only musical adventure, as we'll see in a few minutes. So why don't we listen to a couple of poems from the 1930s? The first is an extraordinarily powerful anthem for Black women, many of whom had to endure a very rough and tough road. It's called The Negro Mother. Uh, I'm going to be reading it to you. You're going to note that some of the historical allusions in the poem include a reference to the Red Sea, which is not only a biblical reference, but also the name given to the Atlantic Ocean that millions of African women crossed on their way to slavery in America in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century. Children, I come today to teach you a story of the long, dark way that I had to climb, that I had to know in order that our race might live and grow. Look at my face, dark as the night, yet shining like the sun with love's true light. I am the dark girl who crossed the Red Sea, carrying in my body the seed of the free. I am the woman who worked in the field, bringing the cotton and the corn to yield. I am the one who labored as a slave, beaten and mistreated for the work that I gave. Children sold away from me, my husband sold too. No safety, no love, no respect was I due. 300 years in the deepest South, but God put a song and a prayer in my mouth. God put a dream like steel in my soul. Now, through my children, I'm reaching the goal. Now, through my children, young and free, I realize the blessing given to me. I couldn't read then. I couldn't write. I had nothing back there in the night. Sometimes the valley was filled with tears, but I kept trudging on through the lonely years. Sometimes the road was hot with the sun, but I had to keep on till my work was done. I had to keep on. No stopping for me. I was the seed of the coming free. I nourished the dream that nothing could smother deep in my breast, the Negro mother. I had only hope then, but now through you, dark ones of today, my dreams must come true. All you dark children in the world out there, remember my sweat, my pain, my despair. Remember my years heavy with sorrow, and make of those years a torch for tomorrow. Make my path a road to the light out of the darkness, the ignorance, the night. Lift high my banner out of the dust. Stand like free men supporting my trust. Believe in the right. Let none push you back. Remember the whip and the slaver's track. Remember how the masters in struggle and strife still bar you the way and deny you life, but march ever forward, breaking down bars. Look ever upward at the sun and the stars. Oh, my dark children, may my dreams and my prayers impel you forever up the great stairs. For I will be with you till no white brother dares keep down the children of the Negro mother. It has to be one of my favorite Hughes poems. So powerful. Meanwhile, Hughes's visit to the Soviet Union in 1932 inspired other powerful statements. like this one called Good Morning Revolution. Good morning, Revolution. You are the best friend I ever had. We're going to pal around together from now on. Say, listen, Revolution. You know the boss where I used to work, the guy that gave me the air to cut expenses? He wrote a long letter to the papers about you. Said you was a troublemaker, a alien enemy. In other words, a son of a bitch. He called up the police and told them to watch out for a guy named Revolution. You see, the boss knows you are my friend. He sees us hanging out together. He knows we're hungry and ragged and ain't got a damn thing in this world and are going to do something about it. The boss got all his needs, certainly. He's swell, owns a lot of houses, goes vacationing, breaks strikes, runs politics, bribes police, pays off Congress, and struts all over the earth. But me, I ain't never got enough to eat. Me, I ain't never been warm in winter. Me, I ain't never known security. All my life been living hand to mouth, hand to mouth. So listen, Revolution, we're buddies. See, together we can take everything: factories, arsenals, houses, ships, railroads, forests, fields, orchards, bus lines, telegraphs, radios. Jesus, raise hell with radios. Steel mills, coal mines, oil wells, gas, all the tools of production. Oh, great day in the morning. Everything. And turn them over to the people who work. Rule and run them for us, people who work. Oh boy, them radios broadcasting that very first morning of the revolution to the USSR, another name of the international Soviets done come. Greeting to the socialist Soviet republics. Hey, you're rising workers everywhere. Greetings. And we'll sign in. Germany. Sign it, China. Sign it, Africa. Sign it, Italy. Sign it, America. Sign it with my one name, worker. On that day, when no one will be hungry, cold, oppressed, anywhere in the world again. That's a job. I've been starving too long. Ain't you? Oh, let's go. Revolution. Now, the 1940s continued Langston's vocal appeal for civil rights for all. He became involved in the March on Washington movement, which was an important force in African American politics in the early 1940s. It was formed to protest segregation in the armed forces. A. Philip Randolph, the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, proposed the idea of a national black-led march on the Capitol in Washington, D.C. in July of 1941 to highlight that issue. But a week before the protest, a very alarmed President Roosevelt, and at the instigation of Eleanor Roosevelt, signed Executive Order 8802, establishing the first Fair Employment Practices Committee. In return, Randolph canceled the march but established the March on Washington Movement, the MOWM, to hold the committee to its mission of desegregating the armed forces and to continue agitation for civil rights. Well, needless to say, it wasn't until Harry Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948 that the American military was desegregated. And then, of course, there was also the 1963 March on Washington and the Civil Rights Bills of 1964 and 1965. It really wasn't until these three events that you began to see some kind of a change. But for Hughes, the Second War became an opportunity for civil rights activism. But the end result of this activism was the FBI opening and ongoing surveillance of Hughes. which, by the way, amounted by the time of his death to hundreds and hundreds of pages. Now, in terms of his writing during the 1940s, Hughes hit pay dirt with the creation of a delightful Black character called Jesse B. Semple, also known as Simple. And he wrote it for the Chicago Defender. Kind of think of Armistead Moped's wonderful Tales from the City stories that he wrote for the San Francisco Chronicle. This is kind of the same thing. Jesse Simple became everybody wanted to read, the next little story, the next little vignette in the Chicago Defender. And Langston Semple's stories ran for over 2 decades, from 1943 all the way to 1966, and proved to be some of his most popular work. The success of Jesse B. Semple, as well as his civil rights activity, became the impetus for annual and very lucrative national speaking tours. But financially, his greatest success came with a Broadway show, and that was the 1947 musical Street Scene. Based on a play by Elmer Rice, Hughes wrote the song lyrics. The music was by Kurt Weill, who you probably know from the Three Penny Opera, right? By 1948, he had earned over $10,000 in royalties from that musical, a fortune in the post-war economy. And it was enough money to purchase a townhouse in Harlem on 127th Street that became his home for the rest of his life. And you can visit that home today. Now, the original play Street Scene won the Pulitzer Prize in 1929, and Hughes and Weill transformed it into the great success of the 1947 Broadway season. Indeed, it won a Tony Award for Best Musical Score at the very first Tony Awards in 1947. So that's a little piece of trivia. The Tony Award started in 1947, and the winner was Street Scene. Now, since its first run, Street Scene has gone on to have many revivals, including several by major opera companies around the world. Now, at the same time that Street Scene was having this huge success on Broadway, Hughes was inspired to write a poem called Freedom Train. Now, here's the background. 2 national freedom trains have toured the United States. There was one in 1947 to 1949. It was a special exhibit freedom train. Talk about that in a second. And then there was a second one in 1975 and 76 to celebrate the American bicentennial. Now, each train had its own special red, white, and blue cars and a route that took them through the lower 48 states, and each stopped at various cities to display Americana, historical artifacts, etc. And that's why the 47-49 train was called a special exhibit train. The 47 train, for example, was intended to be integrated. Black and white viewers could be allowed to mingle freely and was intended to display documents like the Declaration of Independence. Okay. Well, the announcement of the 1947 Freedom Train provoked lively debate about freedom for Blacks in America. Langston Hughes' poem is sarcastic and critical in tone. He describes the Freedom Train passing through segregated southern states where Black and white passengers had to ride in separate cars. The poem became a rallying cry and was even recorded by the famous Black performer Paul Robeson. Now, facing significant backlash by the public and the press, the Truman administration announced in September of 1947 that the train would be desegregated. But when town officials in southern cities like Birmingham, Alabama, and Memphis, Tennessee, refused to allow blacks and whites to see exhibits at the same time, the Freedom Train skipped those planned visits, all of which caused further controversy. Now, here are the opening few stanzas of Hughes's poems. I read in the papers about the Freedom Train. I heard on the radio about the Freedom Train. I seen folks talking about the Freedom Train. Lord, I've been a-waiting for the Freedom Train. Washington, Richmond, Durham, Chattanooga, Atlanta, way across Georgia. Lord, Lord, Lord. Way down in Dixie, the only trains I see's got a Jim Crow coaches set aside for me. I hope there ain't no Jim Crow on the Freedom Train. No back door entrance on the Freedom Train. No for colored on the Freedom Train. No white folks only on the Freedom Train. Oh, I'm going to check up. I'm going to check up on this Freedom Train. Who's the engineer on the Freedom Train? Can a coal black man drive the Freedom Train? Or am I still a porter on the Freedom Train? Uh, is there ballot boxes on the Freedom Train? Do colored folks vote on the Freedom Train? When it stops in Mississippi, will it be made plain everybody's got a right to board the Freedom Train? Well, I'm going to check up. I'm going to check up on this Freedom Train. Now, during the height of the McCarthy era in the early 1950s, Hughes was accused of being a communist by the political right, though he always denied it. In 1953, he was called before the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. You see a picture on your screen of that. Now, according to official Senate transcript, Hughes totally distanced himself from his political past, stating, I never read the theoretical books of socialism or communism, or the Democratic or the Republican parties for that matter. And so my interest in whatever may be considered political has been non-theoretical, non-sectarian, and largely emotional, and born out of my own need to find some way of thinking about this whole problem of myself. Well, following this testimony, Hughes was rebuked by some of the radical left who had previously supported him. They called him a turncoat, right? He moved away from overtly political poems towards much more lyrical subjects. And when selecting his poetry for his selected poems published in 1959, he excluded all his radical socialist verse from the 1930s, including that poem that I had read to you earlier, Good Morning Revolution. Well, meanwhile, during the 50s, he continued to have great popular success with Jesse B. Semple in the Chicago Defender, especially when the stories were published as separate books. They were compiled, right, into books. He also devoted himself to young adult and children's literature. Now, as we've already noted, as a result of the McCarthy hearings, Hughes distanced himself from his socialist and communist writings. And as I said, that when his selected poems were published in 1959, he omitted them completely. Well, finally, by the end of the 1950s, he began working partnerships with several composers, both on operas and choral works. But that ended in 1960 when he and one of the composers, Jan Meyerowitz, and I put this in air quotes, disagreed about how to set his words to music. In other words, they had a fight, and Hughes just eventually said, you know something, I'm not going to deal with this, and I'm not, while I'm still here, I'm not going to allow people to set my poetry to music. Now, as far as poetry from the 1950s is concerned, his poem Harlem, from Montage of a Dream Deferred, became one of his most well-known, especially after the Black playwright Lorraine Hansberry took one of its lines as the title for her most famous play. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? How about this poem from 1955 called Georgia Dusk, which reminds me in some ways of Billie Holiday's song Strange Fruit. Sometimes there's a wind in the Georgia dusk that cries and cries and cries its lonely pity through the Georgia dusk, veiling what the darkness hides. Sometimes there's blood in the Georgia dusk, left by a streak of sun, a crimson trickle in the Georgia dusk. Whose blood? Everyone's. Sometimes a wind in the Georgia dusk scatters hate like seed to sprout its bitter barriers where the sunsets bleed. Now, the last few years of his life were spent as an important elder of the African American community. He was finally well off, and he became an influential patron to many new Black writers. He was also invited by both the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations to become a spokesperson for the State Department. And indeed, he went on numerous African trips, including visits to Nigeria, Uganda, Egypt, Ghana, and Senegal. In 1962, he became a weekly columnist for the New York Post, which at the time was a politically moderate daily newspaper. Now, for those of you who are watching this on the East Coast or have East Coast roots, you know that today the Post is an extremely conservative tabloid run by the Murdoch family. Hughes would probably cringe at the thought because when he wrote for it, it was a very moderate, almost liberal paper. Now, during his last decade, Hughes supported the moderate approach of the NAACP and of Dr. Martin Luther King. And that put him at odds with the more activist members of the civil rights movement. Indeed, he began to rail against what he called the racial chauvinism and obscenity in radical contemporary Black American writing and the arts, especially by authors like James Baldwin, Leroy Jones, later known as Amiri Baraka, and others. In other words, he had little time for the emerging Black power or the Black arts movement. Sadly, on May the 22nd of 1967, Hughes died at the age of 66 from complications after prostate cancer surgery. His ashes were interred beneath a floor medallion in the middle of the foyer of the Schomburg Center in Harlem. So if any of you ever do visit there, you can see this memorial to Hughes. You can see that foyer on your screen. I put a photo of that. And this area marks the entrance to the auditorium that's named after him, the Langston Hughes Auditorium. The floor design, right in the middle there, that design is entitled Rivers. And the title, of course, is taken from his first great poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. And I've just put that up on the lower right of your screen. Within the center of the design is a line from that poem, My soul has grown deep like the rivers. So that's quite a remarkable and passionate life. But before we close, I'd like to share one last poem. And it was written at the beginning of his career in 1925 and was published several times afterwards, including in his selective poems of 1959. Today, it's probably his most well-known poem. It's probably his most quoted poem. And here it goes. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. Now, as you can see from the little note that I've put on the right side of your screen, the earliest versions of the poem said, I'll sit at the table. You could see that I've underscored that with a yellow marker, put a little asterisk there. The original line was, um, yeah, I'll sit at the table. But for that 1959 collection, he changed the line to the way we know it today, which is, I'll be at the table. He won't just sit at the table, he'll exist at the table of America. And that idea is further supported in the last line. He doesn't just sing about America, which is the opening line, I too sing America. He is America in that last line, right? You see that change from I too sing America, it becomes I too am America. Well, before we open this up, I thought you'd like this beautiful quote. Perhaps the mission of an artist is to interpret beauty to people, the beauty within themselves. Love that. Remember, you can take Deeper Dive number 15 on my website, makingwings.net, for more information. But before we talk about next month, I'd like to thank you for being here today. And now it's your turn. What are some of your thoughts and ideas?
I have a question. Be-
Okay.
Besides his father, who was his family? Did they have any love interest? Did they have any children or?
Yeah, no, he did not. It's a great question. He never married. Um, there was always a question of whether he was a closeted gay man. Um, Even that is not particularly provable, but no wife, no children, no siblings. And it was his biological father, his stepfather, his mom. And so he kind of was out in the world on his own, little ship sailing on the sea by himself.
Well, for the kind of work that he was doing, I guess that was the best thing because he was all over the world.
Oh, absolutely. And later on in life, he certainly became a great educator. He went on speaking engagements and so forth, but he eventually, especially starting in the 40s and 50s, started writing children's books. They're listed on the bibliography that I have on my website. I focused on the poetry today, but there are the short stories, there are the novels, but there's this whole group of children's books that are really quite wonderful. So I think he kind of vicariously adopted his kids. It's funny. As a very personal side note, I don't have any kids, but for the first 4 years of my teaching career, I taught second grade. I taught second grade during the daytime while I was getting my PhD in the evening. There was a juxtaposition. And then once I got my doctorate, then I moved on to college teaching. And sometimes, believe me, I rued the day that I left the kids. But uh, those kids, in very real way, became kind of like my kids, my children. I loved my little second grade classes. And that was during the 1970s when we didn't have all these rules and regulations. And, if a kid fell down on the playground, you could give them a hug, or you could put a Band-Aid on. Now, of course, nowadays you can't touch because for fear of a lawsuit. But it was really a wonderful experience. And the equal sign that I'm making is that I think that is exactly what happened with Hughes, that through his writing and through his speaking engagements involving children, and going to bookstores and reading, story time with, with Uncle Langston, that was a way that he nurtured that experience of his life.
Before one asks her question, let me just stop the recording. Maybe I